War and conflict has broken out in Victoria 3 between the Ottoman Empire and the Egyptians, supported by a few different parties along the way. We'll talk everything from mobilizing our generals and armies through to justifying and, of course, ultimately declaring peace around our war and our war goals in this grand strategy gameplay of Victoria 3. It is, of course, provided by the developers. There'll be a link below if you want to check out the full live stream. But in this video, like my last one, and it's drawing from that same gameplay, not a part 2, it's a standalone, but it will follow on from it. We'll be following through their journey playing as Egypt. I'll have some jump cuts, edits, and fast-forwarded sections throughout. And if you appreciate this coverage, I would appreciate you tapping the subscribe button. Sorry, a shameless plug, I know, but we're getting close to 30,000 subscribers. There'll be time cards below as well, referencing different sections in the gameplay, if you prefer to skip ahead or back and look at some of those. And I'll be providing some broader commentary, particularly later in the video, around how I think that this footage in particular has probably changed some people's perceptions on combat in Victoria 3. Now, speaking of which, let's talk about this first section and how it plays out with the broader combat system. Here you can see them selecting some generals to recruit, getting rid of the old ones based on their traits, and pulling in some new, fresh blood, because they're getting ready for conflict with the Ottomans. They're playing as the Egyptians. This war, well, unfortunately, is already written on the wall. It's a matter of time. They're also doing a number of other things. It's not just the commanders themselves being promoted and assigned and so on, but it's also about goods, because, of course, you can't fight a fight without, say, small arms. In this case in particular, they're trying to also balance the budget and bring in some really basic essentials, tools, iron, that kind of thing, while also trying to reinforce their domestic supply, because the role of equipment and how that plays out in the strength of your army in Victoria 3 is very important, and this gameplay footage really reinforced that. The final thing that they're doing in this sort of preparation stage is, I like to call a little bit of diplomatic soul searching. You can see them bounce around different nations while reflecting on their own somewhat poor standard of living and tax rates to try and find allies, maybe, or suppliers for those goods that they're missing. Who are we kidding? It's kind of trade partners, really, in essence. And then they move to making what's called a diplomatic play. There are a whole load of these that you can make in Victoria 3, but of course the one in focus here is warfare. The diplomatic play is declaring a war, justifying a conflict. However, it's also going to be coming at them in a major way, which brings me through into my next topic of conversation, and it's about the government and military. Because, of course, in Victoria 3, while we look here at our enemies and their manpower, for lack of a better word, the number of populations that they have available to become soldiers, we're also looking at different things that we can do as a state to carry out that conflict, using all of that manpower and hopefully putting it to good use. One thing that they noted in particular for this conflict, and it's important to bear in mind, is that, quote, our victory condition here is white peace, end quote. They're looking for something like survival, maybe liberation of someone nearby. Potentially, there's a diplomatic query to justify there, and maybe bring more countries into their realm of control within their market. Here's looking at you to the left. The other thing that they are looking to do as they justify their war goals here is to mobilize the generals. They talked about sort of a decision and a discussion between two different pathways. The first, here, as you can see, mobilizing the generals is quite expensive. So how do you meet that? Well, their option was to basically just go into debt, not bring in your conscripts, and then look to your generals and armies. And here we see both generals on land, but also the Navy. You'll see me zoom in on that a little earlier and later in the video as well. This is where the player-controlled element comes in. This is, of course, a little bit different to other games. I'll talk about that a little bit later in the video. But essentially what they're doing is controlling their armies at the high level. They're grabbing their generals from the right-hand side, and then over on the left-hand side of their screen, they've been assigning them to different things, to defend a front line, to push a front line when it comes to units on land. And then for the naval units, they had different options, of course. Things like raiding convoys that are used for trade, or, of course, full-out naval invasions and assaults from sea to land. Either way, it's time. After all of that preparation and planning has been done, now they are in the midst of conflict. And here the player's focus shifts a little bit more into the detail. We're looking here at specific battles taking place along those front lines where we mobilized our generals, ensured they were equipped, and all of that kind of thing earlier on. And we can see one thing quite interesting that will set the tone for the rest of this video. The battle here, and more broadly, the entire conflict that Egypt is enthralled in, they are outnumbered considerably, okay? So the opposing force, the Ottoman Empire, has many, many, many more troops. However, we have better equipment. Partly, maybe because our technology, our equipment is better, but moreover, because they are sending in, for lack of a better word, kind of their peasantry, somewhat unequipped, untrained, compared to our armed forces. Although they're significantly outnumbered, they also have artillery, which also, as a slight tangential point, highlights the significance of the tech tree and kind of how it comes through to support the 4 or 3 different arms of Victoria 3 gameplay. You know, the military, our internal politics, and our geopolitics. And then, of course, we have that vital economic lens. Here we go again, trying desperately to budget for everything. Here they're balancing a few difficult things. They can increase taxation to get more money to buy more artillery to beat the Ottomans, who don't have artillery. But that will really hurt the coffers, hurt the standard of living, and also increase something else, this radicalism. Radicalism is one of the things in Victoria 3, kind of like an overarching thing that's playing against their war efforts, and I'm sure our war efforts as we become players in Victoria 3 as well. The radicalism, if you're unfamiliar, is kind of like the portion of the population who are a bit more radical to our goals. They don't align with us, maybe they don't support us or agree with us. They don't make very good troops. In fact, they make much better dissidents within government trying to plot against us, right? So they're really altogether not very useful populations. It's not great to have a lot of radicals. We'll also see our debt mounting against us as well here, as you can see, factors influencing the war support. Most importantly, of course, that's kind of codename for morale. If our troops' morale is low, loads of radicals, then we're in trouble. The other thing that's really important that we'll see become more important as the gameplay progresses is attrition and the role of the map itself. Unlike in a zoomed-in 4X game where we're grabbing individual units on tiles, here the map plays a different role. It's about supply lines connecting major ports to front lines. And that is actually one specific thing that played out in this gameplay that was incredibly fascinating. But there are other things playing out here as well. You can see them fiddling with iron mines and barracks in particular. We need more people in our barracks to become soldiers. We need more iron to make them tools, to make equipment. We need more money for all of that. But, as I mentioned earlier, our population is radicalizing. It's turning against us. This is the internal domestic battle that's playing out, while on the global stage, they're fighting multiple fronts. It's a really fascinating example of combat in Victoria 3 and how it plays out at both the state level, but also down here at these individual battles, looking at troops and morale, their strength, how many battalions do they have? In our case, we're generally outnumbered, but much better equipped. Which brings me back to the overall sort of theme that they're pushing for here. They're pushing for attrition. They're pushing to just hold the line, grab a few things in the deal at the end, thanks to coming out better off. However, we will also see them push the front line and advance the conflict in a couple of minutes. Time card below if you want to just speed ahead to that. But don't, because it's terrible for watch time, but more importantly, because I'd like to talk now about how the things that I've just discussed and how this conflict is playing out, whether it's poorly funded military buildings and an underfunded military being willed along by some shiny artillery being imported from overseas. This are some of the key takeaways from Victoria 3's combat live stream, which is kind of what this part of it was. And of course, let's not forget, Victoria 3, very much sort of a political economy simulator with military and diplomacy all thrown in. And then, of course, we have sort of Paradox's other areas, right? Crusader Kings, focused on dynasty and lineage and family and characters and events. And then you have, say, Hearts of Iron, a much more conflictual, combatant sort of game, all of which falling into grand strategy with these wonderful maps in the background. I was particularly impressed by a couple of things to do with this fight in particular. Firstly, it seemed to demonstrate that more minor, less powerful nations could absolutely be playable, and you can have some real fun with them too, within their limits, and if you play to their strengths, even more so. Moreover, though, and you'll see a particular clip of this more toward the end of the video, it was quite striking to me one moment in particular, where the player, the Egyptians, were able to push a front line slightly aggressively, but it worked, and cut off a market from enemy armies. That meant that they couldn't resupply. This was a major supply line in a major market. I'm not talking a corner dairy, by the way. They cut off that supply, and it really made a big difference. All of a sudden, this, granted slightly better equipped, but incredibly outnumbered army were able to hold their own. No, I'm not talking miraculous, movie scene, pulling out my thing and slaying 1,000 people, Jon Snow style. But it was realistic, it was believable, it was gritty, and it was cool to see it play out. It was really great to see the role of overarching supply play through in combat. Wicked to see, and what I would expect of a grand strategy game of this style. I'd like to see, hopefully when the full release comes out, the AI and generals take advantage of this through different things, like potentially and hopefully not letting this happen too often on the AI's front, particularly on higher difficulties, but also more importantly, we could probably see it play through with generals and their traits and different leadership styles. Another thing that I found particularly interesting about combat in this live stream, overall it seemed pretty good. We've seen how fighting on multiple fronts work, right? We have the northern fronts and then also the western front in this gameplay in particular. They also demonstrated how small but tactical decisions can play out and have reasonably large impacts, like that one I talked about before by cutting off supply. It wasn't the only one, of course, so the right timed strike can make a big difference. They're also looking through at how different fronts are supplied. You can see there's sort of 3 or 4 different fronts that they're clicking on, monitoring how well defended they are at a sort of a grander level, how many battalions of troops are waiting, and the broader equipment level, but not getting too deep into the detail, because of course this is a simulator about geopolitics rather than individual movement of units. It was interesting to see the especially powerful display of both technological unlocks and trade. Here I'm thinking in particular about the artillery. Really, really interesting. As we come to advance the conflict and move towards peace, maybe one last push, as you might be able to see playing out on screen, it also makes me reflect a little bit more broadly on what's happening here at the very end of the fight. We see a few interesting things, gameplay-wise anyway. We see troops moving and being cut off from one line, then being intercepted on the way back, i.e. the Egyptian troops were sort of a little bit ambushed by the Ottoman troops, or vice versa, sorry, and then they were able to resupply at a loss of attrition. All of this is playing out almost behind the scenes, though. It's important to note, if you're unfamiliar with Victoria 3, we're not necessarily directly controlling all of these in real time, but rather, as governors following the geopolitics of the state, we're more interested in ensuring that these battles can play out, and then assigning the overarching orders to the generals and the admirals. I think while it was very impressive, and will probably, and at least looking at the comments on my last video also, have a pretty good impact on how people see warfare in Victoria 3, how it plays out. There are, of course, still a few things that could have been tweaked. One of the most common observations that I noticed from watching it and from watching through the live comments was that there could have perhaps been a little bit more visual going on with the map, with troops and ships. It's wonderful to see some of the overlays that you may have noticed in this as well, hovering over individual battles, seeing how they're going, strength, defense, that kind of thing. Assigning orders to the commanders, the admirals, generals, sorry, and sort of telling them which lines to push, which seas to invade, that kind of thing. All really good, and what I would expect from a geopolitical simulator at this level. But it would be nice to see, as people have pointed out, maybe some explosions or signs of troop convoys moving across the map. Some sort of visual giveaways to support what is undoubtedly a very well formulated and informed system. And here, you can see the conflict concluding as we move toward peace, adjusting the different war goals, peace deals, and justifications to try and pull perhaps some people into our into our zone of control. They talked a lot about these deals as well, and talked about how some other deals could play out. You could end up with a treaty port, being able to use a country's port, but not taking over it, and loads of other things that we'll have to wait and see. as more Victoria 3 gameplay comes out. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.